They failed 28 times. Then the Empress turned to a human. The plague was already inside the palace walls, when Empress Valera gave the order to kill her 28th advisor, not out of cruelty. Out of despair, the Solvane Empire stretched across 9 star systems. It had survived 2 extinction-level wars, a supernova that swallowed an entire colony world, and 3 centuries of internal civil conflict. It had never faced anything like this. The rot, as her people called it, did not discriminate. It moved through the atmosphere of every Solvani world like breath, invisible, patient, and total. It dissolved the crystalline neural clusters that Solvani used to think, to communicate, to feel. The victims did not die in agony. They simply stopped, mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-breath. They stood or sat or lay where they were, eyes open, until their bodies gave out 3 days later. 28 of the finest scientific minds in the Empire had been given every resource, every facility, every classified database the Empire possessed. 28 times the answer had not come. 28 times the rot had taken another world. Advisor Kethal had been the last. He had promised a cure within 40 cycles. He had delivered a theoretical framework. Empress Valera had him removed from the chamber with the quiet efficiency her staff was trained to perform. She stood at the window of the high tower now, looking out over the capital city of Solvec Prime. Below, the streets were half empty. The ones who could afford passage off-world had already left. The ones who remained moved in small, careful clusters, as if staying close to each other could somehow hold off what was coming. Her chief aide, Orith, entered behind her without announcement. That alone told her the news was serious. Another district has gone silent, Orith said. She did not turn from the window. Which one? The Eastern Science Quarter. The Eastern Science Quarter housed nearly 400,000 people. Had housed. How long until the Palace District? She asked. 17 cycles by current projection. 17 cycles. Not enough time for a 29th advisor to fail. Not enough time for another theoretical framework. Orith hesitated. That was also unusual. Orith did not hesitate. Speak, she said. There is an option that has not been presented to the council, he said carefully. I did not bring it forward earlier because the source would have been considered beneath consideration. She turned from the window then. Her 4 eyes settled on him with a particular stillness that her staff had learned to treat as a warning. Beneath consideration, she repeated. The human. She waited. His name is Calvin Marsh, Orith said. He is a xenobiologist and systems analyst attached to the Human Diplomatic Outpost on Relay Station 7. He has been requesting an audience for 11 cycles. About the rot. Yes. And his request was denied 11 times. 10 times, Orith said. The 11th request arrived 4 cycles ago. It has been sitting in the lower correspondence queue. She studied Orith's face. Why are you bringing this to me now and not 11 cycles ago? Orith's secondary eyelids flickered. The Solvani equivalent of a flinch. Because when the first request arrived, our planetary analysts ranked the probability of a human understanding the rote at less than 2%. The species has only been in contact with us for 30 years. Their science is considered derivative. Their lifespan is brief. It did not seem worth your time. And now, Now 17 cycles remain, Your Majesty. And every option ranked above 2% has been exhausted. Empress Vealira looked back out at the city. Oh, the half-empty streets, the quiet that was not peace but something much worse, the silence of people who had stopped hoping. "Get me the human," she said. Calvin Marsh arrived at the palace 18 hours later by human reckoning, just over one cycle in Salvani time. He was younger than Orith had expected. Humans aged in ways the Salvani found difficult to track, but Orith had learned to read the lines and the gravity in their faces. This one did not have many lines. He carried a single case of equipment and a portable data pad that looked embarrassingly primitive against the architecture of the palace receiving chamber. He did not bow when the Empress entered. He nodded, a human gesture of respect that was technically insufficient by Solvani court protocol. No one corrected him. Empress Vealira did not sit on her formal throne. She stood across the chamber floor from him and studied him the way she studied problems, completely without expression. "You have been requesting this audience for 11 cycles," she said. Her translator caller rendered it in his language without delay. "My advisors considered your request irrelevant." Calvin Marsh looked at her steadily. "I know. You persisted anyway." "I did." "Why?" He set his datapad on the floor, opened it, and turned the screen toward her. On it was a detailed molecular diagram that her own scientists had been building for months. And beside it, an extension of that diagram that none of her scientists had reached. "Because I think I know what the rot actually is," he said. "And I think your scientists have been solving the wrong problem." The chamber was very quiet. "Explain," said the Empress. He did. For the next 2 hours, Calvin Marsh stood in the receiving chamber of the most powerful ruler in 9-star systems and explained, in plain and simple terms, what 28 of the greatest Salvani scientific minds had missed. He was not arrogant about it. He was not nervous either. He spoke the way someone speaks when they have rehearsed the words so many times that the rehearsal is over and only the truth remains. The rot was not a plague. It was not a biological agent at all. It was a response. The Salvani crystalline neural clusters, the biological structures that made their cognition possible, emitted a resonance frequency during high-stress activity. A frequency that, when amplified across population-dense areas, created a feedback loop in the atmosphere. The rot was the atmosphere responding to that frequency, not attacking the Salvani, reflecting their own signal back at them, concentrated and destructive. 28 advisors had been trying to develop a cure for a disease that did not exist. The solution was not medical. It was architectural, environmental, simple in theory, staggering in scale, and something no Salvani scientist had proposed, because no Salvani scientist had been willing to consider that the empire itself was the source of its own extinction. Calvin Marsh had been willing to consider it because he was human, because he was an outsider who had spent 3 years reading every piece of Salvani science he could access, cross-referencing it with Earth-based xenobiology, and asking the one question no one inside the Empire had thought to ask: what if the patient is not sick? What if the patient is the cause? Empress Vealira stood very still through his entire presentation. When he finished, she looked at him for a long time. "If you are right," she said at last, "the implementation alone will take resources beyond anything we have committed to a single project in 2 centuries. "Yes," said Calvin, "and if you are wrong, we will have wasted 17 cycles on a theory from a species my council considers scientifically adolescent. He met her gaze without flinching. If I'm wrong, you lose 17 cycles. If you do nothing, you lose everything. The Empress turned to Orith. Clear the council chamber, she said, and give this human whatever he needs. Calvin had not slept in 31 hours by the time the first working group assembled in the Imperial Council chamber. He did not look tired. He looked like a man running on something stronger than sleep, the particular energy that comes when a person has been carrying a theory alone for too long and finally has the hands to help build it. The chamber held 43 of the Empire's remaining senior scientists. They had been pulled from their individual research stations, their emergency bunkers, their failing laboratories across 4 worlds. They sat in tiered rows around the central floor, watching the humans stand at the display console with the expression of people who had been told to listen and did not yet believe they should. Orith had briefed them on the basics. Calvin could see from their body language, the way Solvani's secondary eyelids stayed partially closed, the slight inward curve of their upper shoulder ridges, that most of them were present in body only. Their minds were already composing objections. He had prepared for that. He did not start with his conclusion. He started with their own data. He pulled up 17 years of Solvani atmospheric readings. He layered over them the population density maps of every affected district. Then he added the resonance output logs from Solvani urban centers during high-stress civic events, elections, military mobilizations, periods of mass public fear. The correlation appeared on screen before he said a single word about it. The silence in the chamber shifted. It went from dismissive to something more careful. A scientist in the third row, older, with the deep amber coloring of the academic caste, spoke first. This correlation exists in our own data sets, she said. Our analysts reviewed it and determined it was coincidental. I know, Calvin said. I read that Determination, the analyst who made it, used a standard Solvani biological framework to assess atmospheric feedback. That framework assumes the source of neural resonance is stable under stress. He pulled up the next slide. In Solvani physiology it is. Your neural clusters are crystalline, fixed-frequency emitters. Under normal conditions, the frequency is low enough that atmospheric absorption handles it without issue. He paused. But the framework was built when Solvani population density was 1/3 of what it is now. It was never updated. The amber-colored scientist was quiet for a moment. You are saying our own scientists missed this because they were using outdated models. I'm saying the models were built by people living inside the system, Calvin said. It's very hard to see the frame you're standing in. Another scientist, younger, his coloring the pale gray-blue of the engineering division, leaned forward. Even if the correlation is valid, the proposed solution requires atmospheric frequency dampeners installed across every major population center in the Empire. The engineering scope is enormous, Calvin agreed. I have a phased proposal. We don't start with the whole Empire. We start with one district here on Solvic Prime. A contained test. He pulled up the schematics. If the rot retreats from that district within 4 cycles, we have proof of concept, and we scale. And if it does not retreat, the gray-blue scientist asked, then I'm wrong, and you've lost 4 cycles and some construction materials. Calvin looked around the room. But I'm not wrong. He said it without performance, not as a boast, as a statement of the same quiet certainty that had kept him filing audience requests for 11 cycles while everyone ignored him. The room sat with that for a moment. Then Empress Veolira, who had been standing at the back of the chamber in silence since the briefing began, stepped forward. The scientists turned. She did not look at them. She looked at the display screen, at the correlation maps, the resonance data, the schematics of the dampeners. "Begin the pilot district preparation," she said. "Allocate full Tier 1 resources." The human leads the technical team. The gray-blue scientist opened his mouth. "That was not a question," said the Empress. The room moved. Calvin spent the next 36 hours in continuous work. The Salvani engineers assigned to him were not slow. Once they accepted the framework, they moved with a precision and speed that frankly impressed him. They were building the first dampener array around a district of 2 million people using technology that had never been used for this purpose, at a scale that had no precedent, under a time constraint that left no room for second attempts. He learned their names, not their formal caste designations, their actual names, the short, informal versions their colleagues used. Yen. Datharil. He was bad at pronouncing the tonal components, and they found this mildly amusing, which helped. Shared laughter across species boundaries is one of those things that sounds poetic from a distance and feels, up close, like the most practical thing in the world. It meant they corrected him instead of dismissing him. It meant they asked questions instead of waiting for him to fail. His contact back at Relay Station 7, a logistics coordinator named Paula Greer, sent him a message at the 30-hour mark that said simply, "You alive?" He sent back, "Working." She sent, "That's not what I asked." He sent, "Yes, working." The construction of the first array finished 3 hours ahead of projection. Calvin stood in the monitoring station with Orith and 3 senior engineers as the system came online. The dampeners were not visible from the street. They were embedded in the district's existing atmospheric processors, invisible infrastructure doing invisible work. The rot did not retreat immediately. Calvin had not expected it to. He had told the Empress it would take up to 4 cycles. He had calculated that estimate conservatively, building in error margins for every variable he could identify. What he had not built in, because he had not known enough to, was the way the Salvani atmosphere near the capital was denser in certain mineral compounds than his models assumed. It slowed the resonance dissipation by about 11%. By the end of the second cycle, the atmospheric readings in the pilot district had dropped measurably. Not enough for anyone to celebrate. Enough for the senior engineers to stop looking at him like he was a problem they were managing and start looking at him like he was a colleague. By the end of the third cycle, the field reports from the district's residential monitoring stations confirmed it. No new cases. The progression had stopped. The gray-blue engineer, his name was Veth, Calvin had learned, stood at the data console and read the numbers 3 times. Then he turned to Calvin with an expression that did not map cleanly onto anything Calvin had a name for. It was not quite gratitude. It was not quite disbelief. It was the look of a person revising a large assumption in real time. "You are not wrong," Veth said. "No," said Calvin. "Our analysts," Veth said carefully, "would not have found this." Calvin thought about 11 cycles of ignored requests, about a correspondence queue, about the word adolescent that Orith had used, and then regretted. "Your analysts are excellent scientists," he said. "They were solving the problem they knew how to see." Orith, standing near the door, said nothing, but he had stopped standing the way he usually stood, slightly angled away the way the Solvani orient themselves when they are managing a situation. He was standing straight. Facing the room, the Empress arrived within the hour. She stood at the data console and read the same numbers Veth had read. She stood there for a long time. 4 worlds are beyond recovery, she said at last. Her voice carried nothing that Calvin could name, but the weight of it filled the room. The populations that remained. Yes, said Calvin quietly. The 8 remaining worlds. The 8 remaining worlds can be saved, he said. With full resource allocation and simultaneous construction across all sites, we can have full coverage in 11 cycles. The rot will have nowhere left to sustain itself. She looked at him then. All 4 of her eyes, which Calvin had learned to read better than most humans ever had. There was something in them that was harder than grief and more complicated than relief. Why did you keep requesting an audience? She asked. After the 5th denial. After the 8th. You are one person from a species we have barely acknowledged. You had no standing here. No obligation. Why continue? He thought about the first time he had seen the Solvani atmospheric data in a publicly available research database that no one was reading carefully anymore because everyone was too busy being afraid. He thought about the night he had connected the last piece, 3 a.m, station time, with cold coffee and a data pad that needed charging, and understood what he was looking at. Because I knew, he said simply. And knowing and staying quiet is its own kind of harm. The Empress studied him for a moment longer. The Empire owes you a debt, she said. Help us with the construction, he said. That's all I need. She almost smiled. It was a small movement, barely visible to someone who did not know what to look for. But Orth saw it, and Veth saw it. And Calvin Marsh, who had spent 3 years learning to read a species that had spent 11 cycles ignoring him, saw it too. The construction moved at a pace that the Solvani historical records would later describe as unprecedented. Calvin Marsh did not sleep more than 5 hours at a stretch for the next 8 cycles. He was present at every site activation, traveling between worlds on Imperial transport vessels that were faster than anything the human fleet operated, eating whatever the Solvani commissary produced that did not trigger an adverse reaction in human biology, and working alongside engineering teams who had gone from polite skepticism to something approaching fierce investment. He made mistakes. He was honest about them. On the 5th world, a high-gravity colony called Verath Station, he had underestimated the interaction between the dampener frequency and the local magnetic field gradient. The first array activation produced a harmonic interference that set back their timeline by nearly a cycle. He identified the error within 6 hours, recalculated, and presented the correction to the team without defensiveness. Veth, who had traveled with him as a permanent liaison, observed this and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Your scientists are trained to present conclusions only when they are certain." So are ours, Calvin said, already pulling up the correction schematics. But certainty is a luxury. Progress needs room to be wrong. Veth processed this. That is either very wise or very reckless. Usually both, Calvin said. Paula Greer, back at Relay Station 7, had become his unofficial communications anchor. She relayed messages between Calvin and the human diplomatic mission, managed his increasingly complicated schedule requests, and sent him regular updates that were mostly practical but occasionally human in the way that mattered. Small observations about what was being said about him back home, small reminders that people were watching. "Earth's listening," she told him at one point. "You know that." "I know," he said. "The diplomatic corps wants a report. Tell them the report is working on it. They're not going to like that." Tell them I'll file a full brief when there's something to brief. Right now, every hour I spend on paperwork is an hour the rot keeps moving." There was a pause. Then Paula said, "You sound different." He was quiet for a moment. "How?" "Like someone who stopped wondering if they were right." He thought about that. It was true. Somewhere between the 8th and 9th dampener array, he had stopped carrying the weight of the question and started carrying only the work. It was lighter, or at least differently heavy. The 8th world came online at the start of the 11th cycle, exactly as he had projected. Captain Rye's process. The atmospheric readings across all 8 remaining worlds began their decline within 48 hours of the final array activation. The rot did not retreat from every world at the same rate. The denser the population, the slower the dissipation. But the direction was unmistakable. Every model, every monitoring station, every atmospheric sensor in the Empire told the same story. It was ending. Calvin was on Solvec Prime when the final confirmation came in, sitting in the technical monitoring room with Veth and 2 of the original team from the council chamber briefing, the amber-colored senior scientist, whose name was Orel, and a younger analyst named Civ, who had not believed a word of his presentation 11 cycles ago, and had since become one of the most relentlessly useful people he had ever worked with. Civ read out the final atmospheric figures from the last monitoring report. Her voice was perfectly steady. The Solvani are not demonstrative people by human standards. They do not shout or embrace. But the quality of silence in that room, the way each of them simply stayed still for a moment, absorbing what the numbers meant, was one of the most complete things Calvin had ever been part of. He was sitting down. He realized he should probably stand, but did not have the particular energy for it at that moment. He was very, very tired. The good kind of tired, the kind that lives on the other side of something finished. "It's done," Civ said. "It was not a question. It's done." Calvin confirmed. Orel looked at him across the room. She had the manner of someone about to say something that cost her something. "I was the analyst," she said. "The one who reviewed the atmospheric correlation data and classified it as coincidental 17 years ago." The room was quiet. "I know," Calvin said. "The framework I used was standard," she said. "It was the correct framework for the problem as we understood it." "Yes," he said. "That does not change what happened to 4 worlds." He looked at her steadily. She was not looking for absolution. She was too precise a thinker for that. She was stating a fact, and she needed it to be witnessed. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She nodded once. That was all. Empress Valera arrived without announcement, which Calvin had come to understand was how she arrived when she considered the occasion too significant for ceremony. She stood in the doorway of the monitoring room and looked at the data screens. Then she looked at the people in the room. Then she looked at Calvin. "The Empire stands," she said. It was not a grand statement. She delivered it the way a person delivers a thing they have been afraid to say for a very long time, and are now saying carefully, as if testing whether the words are real. "The Empire stands," Calvin agreed. She crossed the room and stood before him. This was protocol-breaking behavior. The Empress did not approach. People approached her. The engineers in the room understood this. They also understood enough not to move. "I am going to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to answer it honestly, without diplomatic softening." "All right," he said. "When you began requesting audience, when my court ignored you for 11 cycles, did you believe we were making a mistake? Or did you believe we were simply doing what powerful civilizations do to those they consider lesser?" Calvin looked at her for a moment. Outside the monitoring room's single observation window, the capital city of Solvec Prime was beginning to fill with people again. not the careful, clustered movement of 11 cycles ago. Regular movement, life returning to its ordinary noise. Both, he said. Powerful civilizations make the same mistakes as everyone else. They just have more to lose when they do. She considered this. And you, a representative of a species we have spent 30 years barely acknowledging, you chose to help us anyway. You needed help, he said. That was the whole of it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The Empire owes you a debt that cannot be measured in diplomatic terms." "I don't need a debt," he said. "I need the Solvani to change how the interspecies research protocols work, the databases your scientists use. I should not have been able to access them accidentally through a public relay station archive. There should be channels. There should be collaboration that does not require 11 cycles of ignored requests before someone with standing decides to listen." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You came here to save us, and you are leaving with a policy proposal." "I came here to solve a problem," Calvin said. "This is a problem." Orath, who had been standing near the door in his customary position, made a sound. It was brief and controlled, but it was, Calvin was almost certain, a laugh. "Draft it," said the Empress. "Whatever framework you propose, bring it to the Council. I will ensure it receives a proper hearing." Calvin nodded. He thought about Paula Greer at Relay Station 7. He thought about the diplomatic corps waiting for their brief. He thought about 3 years of reading Solvani research databases in the middle of station nights, alone, making connections that no one around him thought were worth making. He thought about a corridor between species that had been mostly closed, and how much could move through it if someone bothered to build the door. "One more thing," he said. The Empress waited. "The 4 worlds you lost," he said. "The populations that didn't survive." He paused. "I would like to recommend that the memorial, whatever form the Empire chooses, not be dedicated to the rot, or to the scientists who tried to stop it, or to the Empire's resilience." He looked at her steadily. "I would like it to be dedicated to the question that wasn't asked soon enough. As a reminder." The room held very still. "The question," the Empress said. "What if the patient is the cause?" He said it without a question mark, the way it had first occurred to him, alone in the station, reading databases in the dark. Not as a question. As Adore Empress Veolira looked at him for the last time with the full weight of what the last 11 cycles had cost and produced, and she said, "It will be done exactly as you describe." Calvin Marsh left the palace that evening, carrying the same single case he had arrived with. The city around him was louder than it had been when he arrived. Somewhere in the eastern quarter, someone was playing music. Solvani music. Tonal and complex and built on frequencies that humans could hear but rarely understood. He stopped for a moment and listened. Then he walked on, already composing the message to Paula, already thinking about the protocol framework, already looking forward, with the specific orientation of a person who has finished one thing and is ready to start the next, toward whatever the door he had opened might let through. Behind him, Solvec Prime, filled with sound. It had been silent for a very long time.